Okay, let's go ahead and get started. My name is David Abo, and I'm an engineering lead on the Azure team. And today I'm going to be speaking about agile development practices, specifically related to Azure App Platform Web Apps. So you're familiar with the evaluation thing, so make sure to do that at the end and win fabulous prizes. There's a couple of goals that I'd like to convey in this talk, at least a couple of main goals. The first is to become familiar with this thing called Azure Resource Manager, and specifically about templates, which is the new and better way of provisioning resources. And also I'll be demonstrating a deployment workflow that works well alongside Azure Resource Manager using GitHub. So first, I'd like to make a small differentiation between resource provisioning and site deployment. Resource provisioning is more about creating. You create your database, you create your site, you create your scheduler, things like that. Site deployment is how do you get your files inside your site. And I will be covering both today. In terms of provisioning resources, there's a few ways that you can go about it. The way that most people use today is typically you go to the portal and you click around and you create a website and you create a database and you create various things and you hook them together. And it's a great way of exploring the options that are available, all the knobs and all that. But it's not a very good way of getting a consistent deployment. Let's call this the manual way. The next way that people have been using for many years is what I'm calling client-driven automation, which basically means you have something like a PowerShell script or a Bash script running on your client that provisions all your resources. And finally, the new and better way is to use what we call an Azure Resource Manager template. So first, let's look at what's wrong with manual provisioning. And hopefully that should be pretty obvious, but the main problem is that it's not easily repeatable. So to me, the test I always tell people is, okay, now you've created various things and you got something running, congratulations. Now let's assume that via some mistake, everything got deleted. You need to get back as quickly as possible into the same state. Well, if you're doing it all step by step via the portal, you're going to have a hard time manually setting up the connection string and all that. Likewise, if you'd like to deploy everything into a second region, maybe to run Traffic Manager and get better world coverage for your site. So the next way is to use a PowerShell script, or some other form of script, which of course is far better than the provisioning resources manually and solves a lot of the problems, but it still has some issues in terms of doing really too much logic in your client and using imperative logic. Which is pretty much you writing code in PowerShell or other language. And code is hard to parallelize. Like, for instance, if you have two resources that don't depend on each other and that could very well be provisioned at the same time, if you write a PowerShell script, chances are you're going to do it sequentially. There's also something to be said about avoiding to round-trip secrets. If you provision resource A, which could be a website, and you need to get the publishing profile to a different resource, if you do a PowerShell script, chances are you're going to grab it down to your client, push it back to the server. With Azure Resource Manager templates, we really solve all those issues by having a true cloud-based orchestration engine. So the whole syntax is declarative. It's a big JSON file, which can be intimidating at first, but you do get familiar with it fairly quickly. It is idempotent. That's a key concept. You can rerun it multiple times and get the same result, which may not always be the case with a PowerShell script. And because it is declarative and knows about the whole dependency graph, it can make the right optimizations and run things in parallel if it needs. It also solves the problem about secrets. Another advantage, the one I list last, is that it's actually very transparent with the Azure API. If you look at a template and you know how to read a template, you can tell exactly what API calls are being made. Whereas with PowerShell commandlets, they are kind of higher level and you don't really see what's going on. First, a small note in terms of the Azure API. For quite some years, we've had an API known as Azure Service Management, sometimes called RDFE. That's the old one. You should stop using it, if at all possible. The new one is Azure Resource Manager. So I'll start by giving a quick demo, because it's really hard to talk about templates without first talking about what does the Azure API look like. So I'll switch to my console here. And I have a little tool here called ARM Client, which is a tool. You can search for it and find it. It's something that one of my coworkers wrote. It's not a super official tool, but basically view it as doing curl over the Azure API, except it takes care of authentication. So let's look at the shape. Is this readable, the size here, or that's a bit small? I would make it larger. OK. OK. Is that better? OK. So what do ARM URL look like? Well, they're pretty simple. It's always you have many subscriptions, and then you have the specific subscription. Then you have many resource groups. How many of you are familiar with resource groups? OK, quite a few. So it's basically, in the ARM world, the resource group is a way of grouping resources. So it really is what it is. So on the resource group, you have many, so a specific resource group name. And then there's always, first of all, there's always an API version at the end, because the API is versionable. So whenever you make a call, there's always a version. And then going down, so let me actually run these things as I go along. If I run the first one, this is going to list my resource groups. If I run the second one, it's going to give me the detail on one specific resource group. The third one here will show me all my sites, and then my specific site called Hackbox, which is the site where I experiment with various things. The site can have slots, and here I'm looking at the detail of a specific slot. So you get the idea. It's very hierarchical. And also, there's a concept of resource type and resource name. Resource type are things like sites and slots that are just kind of the shape of the URL, whereas here, Hackbox, which is the name of my site, and staging is the name of my slot. This is viewed as the resource name. So we have a very nice new tool that allows you to experiment with this API in a much easier fashion compared to using this command line tool. And we call it Azure Resource Explorer. So if you can log into the portal, you can access this. And within this, you get to see your subscriptions. Sorry. There you go. Good call. So you'll recognize this is the exact same shape that I was showing you earlier from the command line, except now you don't have to know what it is, because you can discover it. So if I go drill into, let's look for the exact same place where I was, Microsoft.web, sites. In fact, there's even a search feature. So if I type Hackbox here, I can find the site called that. It goes right to the right location. It does a get. You can see the URL, exactly what it does. This is the exact same URL I was showing you from the command line. You can even use this tool to make small edits. I could change a field and then do a put. So basically, it's a great way to learn about the API. There's even a documentation tab, which gives you help on the various fields. So if you haven't seen the API, I really suggest that you just head over to this tool to watch your own resources and what they look like at API level. But now let's move on to actually talking about templates. This was just sort of an introduction to help get started with templates. So I'll show you a very simple template here. This template, all it does is create an app hosting plan. I'm getting the wrong name because we keep renaming things. App service plan, I'm sorry. Used to be called web hosting plan. And in the API, it's called server farm. So yeah, the names have gone through some evolution. So what is the basic structure of these templates? First, there's some schema version. You can more or less ignore that part. Then there are parameters. This is what you need to pass into the template. It's like a function call, you're passing parameters. And then there are the resources. In this case, it's creating this server farm, app service plan, and it's making it free. So the app hosting plan is basically a container for websites. For instance, you could say if you have an app hosting plan that is in standard mode and you scale it to 3 VMs, all the sites that you put in that plan will go on those 3 VMs. And here we have the site, and the site specifies that it wants to be inside this thing above. So let's go ahead and run this thing. So this is going to provision all the resources that are in there. And in fact, even while we do that, we should be able to go in this tool and refresh and already see the things as they are getting created. In this case, it's a new resource group called demo resource group. OK, they're not quite done yet. And to show you the way I'm instantiating this is via a PowerShell command called new Azure resource group, giving it the name of the resource group, the location. Location just happens to be a parameter that gets passed into the template. Same for the site name. And then the name of my JSON template. And when that's done, we'll basically have just an empty site. So let's see. Taking a little while. Let's refresh in here and see what we have. And of course, once you have the resource, it will show up in the portal as well. And here we are, site. I see my site in here. In fact, I can get the URL, run it, and I should get an empty site. So let's move on. So first, I'm going to show you something here that this is the picture of what we want to achieve. It looks very complex if you see it at first. This is where we want to get at. I will go piece by piece over everything. But the general idea is that for our good deployment story, we want to set up something such that developers are checking into committing to the dev branch on GitHub, and that gets provisioned to a dev site. In fact, in my demo, I have there are two different sites. There is a front-end UI site using Angular and a back-end site and a database. And then finally, when a change in dev is good, we want to send it to production. We do an integration into the master branch, which then gets deployed not directly to production, but to a staging slot, which can then get swapped into production. So, but first, the first piece we're going to focus on is just this dev branch. So we're going to go back here, and that's the next template I want to create. So I'll first start the creation process here. And I'm entering a password for the database. And while it's doing that, we'll take a look at, we can close this template, and we'll see the template here. So this is a much larger template, and we're not going to go through everything, but structurally, it's not that different from what we saw. It takes parameters, except there are a bunch more. And it has resources. In this case, it has first a SQL server, which contains a SQL database, has some firewall rules. It has the same, this server farm, this app service plan. Then it's going to put not one, but two sites into it, because we have our front-end site and our back-end site. And that's pretty much it. Well, in addition to that, it actually sets a bunch of properties, app settings, and connection string. And that's actually one of the key points, that not only I create a database and some sites, but it's able to connect the two. If you take, for example, the connection string here, I'm setting into the backend side a connection string which I set to a value which references the SQL server and gets the connection string. And this whole thing happened without the connection string ever round-tripping through the client. So let's see how it's doing here. Should be almost done. A couple more things to look at here. Oh, yes, one thing that's interesting is since the front-end UI site needs to talk to the back-end site, it needs to deal with cores because it's going across to a different domain. So in order to set that up properly, the back-end site is being given the URL to the front-end site, so it can allow it in cores. And likewise, the front-end site is being given the path to the API, so you can call it. So it kind of shows, it's not just about instantiating 3 resources, but it's also about hooking them up all together. And that's why it would be very difficult to do all by hand. So now let's go to the portal, where we should see those resources coming up. And there we go. So we'll go and run it. So that's the front end. It's talking to the back end. The back end needs to warm up the database. And there's the first time the database gets created on the fly using an entity framework. And here we are. It's just a silly little to-do list, just to illustrate. And I can mark things as done, and I can add new one, dev, data. So the idea here is that this is a site, this is not your production site. This is a site that whenever one of your devs merges something into the dev branch, it goes live. So you always have a site that has this latest. The quality level here is going to be, of course, you should have some tests first before it gets there, but it's not going to be the same quality as production, and that's OK because no customers are hitting that. So next, we are, sorry, let me go back to the slide. And so yeah, a few notable points that, first of all, I really only did one action to achieve all that, is deploy one template. And no secrets are stored. Like if you were to look at the web.config for the backend side, you would not see a connection string pointing to the database. You would see the test connection string. Instead, the way it works is that the Azure app setting at runtime overrides that behavior. And the cores I already discussed. So now let's talk a little bit. So now we have our dev side set up, and we want to now set up our production. But instead of doing a production where we directly push to it and it goes live, we're going to use what's called stage deployments, which has a couple benefits. So the first benefit is that you are able, if you choose, to test your site, to hit your site before you swap it into production. Because even though you've tested on the dev slot, that may or may not be exactly the same. And the other benefit is that if you use a staging site, the site gets warmed up before getting swapped. So you don't anchor the first time hit, which can be, can take 10, 15 seconds. So the picture we have here, which is the other half of the big picture I had, it's very similar to the dev one, except we're using staging slots. And within that, there are 2 or 3 workflows that I'll be showing you. So in this next demo, I have another template here, which is similar to the dev one, but slightly modified to actually set up slots. So the template that we saw earlier was basically just creating 2 regular sites and a database. This next template, which we will look at, prod and stage, very similar. But once we go down, so let me skip the part that's really exactly the same. The database is identical. But when it comes to the site, so we see that's the first site. But within that, so it does set for this is, when I say the main site, that's the true production site. But then within that, it's defining a slot, the staging slot, which basically is a second site that still has its own set of properties, but is a separate site that allows us to do the whole swap mechanism. And now, yes, there's actually a key part that I skipped over last time that I will show you now. In addition to app setting and connection string, this thing sets up source control. Yes, I probably didn't make sense earlier why we were actually getting bits deployed when I just instantiated that template. What makes it work is this. There is a parameter that passes it the repo URL, which is my GitHub repo, which would work with a private repo. And you pass the branch as well, and that automatically sets up this site with source control. And to go back to the slide briefly, one thing I want to make clear is that here, it's actually the staging slot that is set up for source control, not the production slot. So when bits go live, they always go onto staging first. So let's see how this guy is going. So it can take, a couple of minutes. It's been about 1. And the next thing that we'll do once it's provisioned is I'll show you how to swap this into prod. So it's done. Let's go back to the preview portal. And let's see the new list of sites. So now we should have 2 new sites. There's to-do app demo dev, and dev API was the dev slot. And now this one is a production slot. So can anyone guess what's going to happen if I launch this one? It's an empty site. That's because we had a deployment happening into the staging slot, but nothing has been swapped into production. If I instead, yes, zoom in, okay. If I instead go to the staging slot for that, I can see the slots UI here, here we are. So it shows that there is a staging slot underneath this site. I should probably turn that off. Boom. Sorry about that. And the staging slot, if I go and browse to that, we'll get an experience that is similar to what we saw last time for the dev slot, which means it's a fresh site that is starting and it's going to create the database. It should be noted that the dev site has its own separate database, whereas the staging and prod are sharing the same database, because the whole idea is to do a hard swap. So in fact, that's the next thing I'm going to do. So here we have in order dev, staging, and production, which is empty. So if I go, why is this still popping up? If I go and swap both sites, because I have two sides, the front end and the back end, and I'll go and swap first the front end, and then the back-end side. So what happens when we swap is kind of interesting in the sense that the main goal that it's trying to achieve is to have no downtime on the production slots, which of course right now is not really relevant because our production slot is empty. But the idea is that it's going to warm up, prepare the staging slot, which is why it can take like 20, 30 seconds to prepare it to be exactly in the right state to be swapped into production. So let's try it now. Oh, it's still working on it. And if I now go into production, boom, I have my state. And see how it was very fast because the swap had done all the preparation. So next, let's try to do more of a full workflow. So I'm just going to make like very silly changes to the code just for illustration. So the to-do list, I'll just add some number. And here, I'll go and push not to prod, but I want to mimic the true workflow that you would go through. So I'm pushing this little change to my dev slot. So what's going to happen here is that it's going to GitHub. And by the way, I should show you that if I go to GitHub here and look, let me zoom that in a little bit, go to the webhook, you can see I have this repository set up now for 4 different webhooks because we have 2 sites in the dev deployment and 2 in the staging. So now let's go to our, say, the UI site, and we can look at what's going on. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm deploying to the dev side now. So if I go to dev and I look at the deployments in the portal, it shows active deployment 222. So right now, this deployment has made it to the dev slot. And let's say we are happy with it. So now it's time to do, we won't wait for it, but we'll do some Git operation in the to-do app. I'll basically merge. And there's lots of ways to do that, but I'm moving. Let me show you the Git pointers. Sorry, I don't know if it's possible to zoom that guy, but basically dev is ahead by 1 commit now, and by doing this, I'm going to move master up to where dev is. And then I'll just push master. So now this is the sort of the full scenario where some development was being done. Let's go back to the slide that was showing that. Development is being made in here. It's going to the dev branch. We have a build that we think is good. We merge it into the master branch. We push to here. It's now going to go in the staging slot. So let's go to the staging slot here. which now has this change. But to make it slightly more interesting, no, it's not showing the back. Maybe the back end is not quite ready. But anyway, you get the idea. But now I could choose to swap it into production, but instead I'm going to do something slightly different, where we have this feature called test in production, which allows you to move some percentage of the traffic over to the production side from the staging side, so that you can say, oh, I'm just going to do 5% for a day and see if no one is complaining, and if not, I'll call it good. So the way we do this is by going to, let me make sure I'm going to the right side. I want to go to the UI side for staging and production, that is. And I'm going to say, under traffic routing, that I would like to steal some traffic away from my production slot and instead send it to my staging slot. And normally, you probably wouldn't do a large percentage, but for illustration, it's easier to give a larger percentage so we can actually see it in action. So move things around a little bit. If I go and refresh, there's kind of a 50% chance. In this case, we got 222. The way that we can tell what's going on, if you look under the cookies, there is this thing called this tip mix. I don't know if yes, I can zoom that in. Oops. And there is a concept of a sticky session. So if a given person on their browser hits a specific site, they're going to be sticking to that slot. Because if you go back and forth between the two, bad things can happen. So that's why there is this cookie. But here, since I want to show you the different behavior, I'll go and delete this cookie and redo it. And here, we happen to get the other one. So each time, there's a 50% chance. And then the next workflow is, once you've done this, you started 1%, 5%, 20%, whatever, finally, you would go and do the full swap. You say, OK, I'm satisfied that what I have is good, and I'm going to swap it. And once you swap, that instantly removes all of those 5% whatever routing rules and say, well, now you've swapped, so whatever was in the staging side is truly 100% in the production side. Now, if I go back to here, I should be getting the 222 all the time, and I no longer have that cookie because the feature is no longer turned on. So that's one possible workflow for the case where you don't, even though you've tried it in your dev slot, you don't have full confidence, and you need to get more confidence bit by bit. In some other workflow, you may say that, well, you have enough quality control at dev. The minute you merge into production, you do want it to go live. So you might ask, if you do that, what's the point of using a slot? And that goes back to the two benefits of using slot I said earlier. The one was to be able to test it, which we're saying we don't need here. But the second one is to avoid the cold start. So that's really using a staging slot for the sole purpose of avoiding the cold start. The way we do this is enable a feature on the slot. So I'll go to my productions, my staging slot here. And under the settings for application setting, there's something called auto swap. So auto swap means exactly what you would expect, where whenever something is pushed into the staging slot, when it's done, it auto swaps it into production. The end result is that you end up getting the bits live into production with 0 downtime. So to show you that, now I'll just make another change far more interesting than the previous one. And sorry, I have little originality for those things. So, and in this case, normally I should push it to dev first and then to master, but in the interest of time, I'm just going to push it straight to my production, or at least straight to master, which will then trigger. So what's happening here, if we go back to our slides, is we are pushing to GitHub on master which is going to cause the deployment to happen in staging, and the minute this deployment is complete, it's instantly going to do a slot. So at that point, you no longer need to do anything explicit. You're trusting that the system is doing its thing at that point. So let's see if that has happened. If I go to production here, let me close this. And here we are. And it was fast right away. So this is basically slots in action. There's more than one workflow. You can choose to swap manually. You can use the traffic routing to do percentage. You can choose to do auto swap. All of these are perfectly valid workflows that work in kind of different circumstances. So now I want to talk a little bit about web jobs. How many of you are familiar with web jobs? Okay, a good number. So one way to look at them is that they're a form of lightweight worker roles that run under Azure App Platform. And there's two main categories of worker job: continuous jobs, which run all the time and typically pick up work from a queue and are always kind of running in some form of loop. And then there is triggered job. Triggered jobs are jobs that don't run until somebody tells them to. And within triggered job, there is kind of two subcategories. One of them is the manual job, which means in order to start it, you really have to, say, go to the portal and say, run now. Or there is scheduled job to say, well, every night at 10 p.m., I want to run some database cleanup script, something or other. What's important to point out is that from the point of view of your web job, there is no difference between manual and scheduled. The only difference comes from the fact that in the scheduled case, there is an external scheduler, which can be the Azure scheduler or could be some completely unrelated scheduler, but there is some scheduler that happens to hit it. The job doesn't know the difference. It just says, well, someone is telling me to go, and I'm going to go. And specifically, what I want to show you here is focus on this orchestration between the scheduler and the web job. And you would guess how that works. It's done via ARM template again. So what I have here is a modified version of the previous template, which I will show you. The fact that I need to re-enter the database password every time is something I could have solved by doing storing it in a secure string and passing it as a parameter, but I just didn't do that. So what I will do now is show you a diff of the previous template with the new one. I thought I could zoom in here. Maybe I can't. Sorry. You know what? I'll just open it in Notepad there. But I'll just show you the high level. The only difference is there is a new job collection name parameter. And at the end, there's a new block that is the scheduler. So let's go and open that in Notepad, which does have zooming. And so really the only difference starts here. So what am I doing here? I'm creating what's called a job collection, which is a container for scheduler jobs. So there's two objects that have similar names. There's web jobs is where you have your code running that needs to be triggered. And the scheduler is the one calling that code, and it itself has an object called job. So that can be a bit confusing, but job is the client, web job is what receives, is the server. So we're defining a job collection, and within that, we're defining a specific web job called hello job. And this guy, the most important line is this line here. It's the line that defines what URL is it going to hit when it fires. And it's a line that looks a little complex, but the key thing is that it's taking from within this template information about your website, including some secret publishing credentials, and basically forming a URL that will be able to call that endpoint, that secret endpoint, without those secrets ever escaping the world of the server-based, the cloud-based orchestration engine. So let's see what's going on with here. So it's done. Another thing I want to point out, the whole part about templates being idempotent is very important. Here, I just reran a template which is identical to the previous one, plus a bunch of other stuff. That means it still went creating all of those other things. You can see all those resources. really, in the world of ARM, there is no significant difference between an initial resource creation and a resource update. You're just doing a put each time. It may be new, it may be existing, but whatever you put is the new state. So let's see what we have here. If I go to the portal and I look at my backend site, so one thing I didn't show you is that I had a job in the solution that I deployed, which is the most silly little job that just has a console.write that say hello for the sake of illustration. But if I go to my production, those blades, okay, production site, and I look at my web jobs, oh, and I messed up because I went to the front-end side when I really have the web job on the back-end side. So we'll get there. Okay, and here we should see a web job. And if I go to here, it opens something that is basically the web jobs portal. It's a different site that for a given web job shows you the history and all. And what we can see here is that it has already fired 3 times. I guess I forgot to point out within the template, I was so focused on the URL, another piece of information is that it sets the recurrence to be every minute. So it's firing now every minute. So if you look at, just for the fun, if we go back to Resource Explorer, we should see all the resources that we've created for our. So this is our production site. See, we now have a scheduler with this job collection in it. We have the SQL server. We have our 2 websites, the server farm and the sites. There's the front-end site, the back-end site. If I go to either of them, it has slots. It has a slot called staging. So everything we've done from the template, you see it right there. Next thing I want to discuss is post-deployment notification. It's what happens when you push a change. What if you want to know what's going on, maybe get a text message or a phone call if something goes wrong. And we have a feature that does that, and it basically fires an arbitrary URL, which can then be hooked up to some external site. And there's a site called Zapier, which allows us to do that. So I'll show you how it's done. And for illustrating this, we'll be using our dev site. So what we'll do here is create a new, let me make it bigger, a new zap. So this is something that matches a trigger to an action. Our trigger is going to be an Azure website. And we want that trigger to happen when a new website deployment happens. And in terms of action, we just want it to use to make a phone call, say. So we could do a text message. Let's do a phone call. And then the next piece is interesting. That's something that here I need to go to the original portal for that one. And if I go to, sorry, I need to refresh it. So the reason I'm going to go to this portal is that it's going to give me the URL that kind of connects those two. The hookup between the Zapier site and Azure is still a little bit more manual than it should be. Ideally, there would be more of an automated workflow. But still, once you have it set up, you're actually in pretty good shape, and you don't need to touch it again. So let's see. Actually, I meant, sorry, let me make sure I grab the right side so I don't mess up. Yes, let's grab this one. Okay, and I'll grab this URL here and paste it into here. Okay, and once it's done, I'll say, yes, you'll give me a phone call. Here I can put filters to say I only want this to happen when it's a failure or a success or a bunch of other conditions. And here there's the text, new deployment from it actually has good knowledge of the fields. So if I put my name here, status was here, and text was, I think there's a message field or something. Yes? Okay. And we'll just continue. I think it should be all set now. So what's going to happen is that now I'm going to go back to my, make sure I'm on my dev slot. Sorry, not dev slot, dev branch, confusing myself. And let's go back to here. Let's see, some more changes. See, I'm kind of changing the theme now. Some other useless change, which I'm pushing to the dev branch, which means it's going to go live on my dev site. So if we go to the portal, we should see the deployment happening here. Oh, I'm already getting the phone call, so that's fast.
New deployment from David Expo. Status, success. Text was, some other useless change.
Okay. So that was that. So of course, I should point out that in practice, I would not set it to give me a phone call for every success, but it totally would make sense to get a phone call or a text or some other strong notification when there is a failure, because you want to know. This site, Zapier is it's an interesting site. They have a free tier that you can try, or for a heavier usage, they have a paid tier. It's worth giving it a try. There are probably alternate solutions that do the same. Like Azure is not tied to that. We just really fire in the end an arbitrary URL. It just so happens we have a little bit of integration with those guys. So let me go back to the slides here. Well, yeah, so that was the picture of what I just showed you, that I pushed a change to the dev branch, went into the UI site, and Zapier gave me the phone call. So another thing I'd like to show you is not directly related to the topic of deployment, but it's just always a nice thing to see. How many of you have played with Kudu and various Kudu features? Just a few. So if I go to, say, the dev site here, any website that you have, if you change the URL to a .scm in there, you will get that admin site, which we call the Kudu site, is sort of the code name. And let me zoom in here. And what you can do from the Kudu side is a lot of things. We have this console. So in this particular case, I went into the dev site arbitrarily, but you would see something similar in all of them. And you can see your files. You have, see, that's my dub root. We see my thing being deployed. We should see the last change that I made here. So there's a really rudimentary editor for make minor tweaks. You can also do file transfers. Oops. So if I go to, I have a folder here, drag and drop, just to show you. I can grab a file here and dump it in here. I can also grab a whole folder, which will expand via drag and drop, which is pretty nice. So that's the test folder, which all got expanded. And even nicer, if you have a lot of files, you can zip them up and you drop them into a special area here, and they get expanded as soon as they land. So now we have both folders. You can also do the reverse. If you have a folder and you want to download it, you click this link, and it gives you a zip back with everything. There's a number of other things you can do in the Kudu UI. I won't show you everything, but one that I like is the Process Explorer that lets you see, okay, in this case, we have W3WP. That's the IIS process that's running. Under that, you can see the properties, and you can see the modules and handles and thread. Lots of pretty low-level stuff, but pretty useful. So I want to show you a couple more things. The first is we have this site that we we call the deploy button, which makes it really easy to deploy from GitHub directly into Azure. So I'll show you, and in this particular case, I want to show you support for ASP.NET 5 Beta 4, which was just announced yesterday. And so let me go to it to illustrate. So you go to a GitHub site. You have some button in here that says deploy to Azure, but it's a pretty regular GitHub site other than having this button. You click on here. It brings up this site. And the reason it's relevant to this topic is that this uses ARM templates under the cover. And it has some nice default. Let's say I'm going to put it in East US. Bang, it has some default name. I'll just keep everything. And at the same time, I'll show you a second one because we haven't really announced it, but we just added some early support for the Go language. Any of you use Go? No? I'll still show it. I don't either, but apparently it's good. I hear it. So exactly the same deal here. I click this deploy to Azure. I'm going to keep all the defaults and deploy. Let's see how the other guy is doing. We can have a race between ASP.NET 5 and Go. So what's happening here is that under the cover, this deploy to Azure site comes up with an ARM template that hooks up to GitHub and does something very similar to the templates that I showed you earlier, without any of the staging or fancy stuff, but just the basics. And while it's doing that, I will show you even the third one, which is fancier. This is this one here. So what this shows is that if the GitHub site on which you put the button, there's nothing special. It's really just a link you can see at the bottom. It's a link to azuredeploy.net. It's nothing more than that. But in this particular case, this contains a file, and I hope you recognize what this file is. Otherwise, you failed the class. This is an ARM template. So what happens is when we click on the button for this site, it goes back to GitHub and it says, well, do you by a chance have your own template instead of just wanting me to use the default one? And if it does, it uses that instead. So I'll just go create that. We don't have to wait for all of them, but while it happens, I'll go back to the first one. So this is our, I believe that was, yeah, ASP.NET 5. We just instantiated this new site. So this is the beta 4 that was just released yesterday. We literally just added the support a couple of days ago. And here we are. And the Go site, hello from Go. You just have to believe that it's Go. Well, actually, well, I should have shown you a couple of files. And this was actually a very simple case. Apparently, this is Go. Apparently, it's good, but yeah. And that's that. And this one is still going, but we don't have to wait for it. And if I have a little more time, yes, I'll show you one last thing before closing up. It's if you go to the main landing page for Azure App Service, we have a cool feature here which allows a user that doesn't even have an Azure account to play with the product. So this is what you see here. Want to get a taste, get going in seconds. You choose your language. You click here. And what's going to happen is, first I have a selection of things I can create. In this case, I'll just create a plain website, and I'll just do an ASP.NET starter site. And look what's happening here. It's asking me to log in. So I can't be completely anonymous here, but I do not need an Azure subscription. I could have a plain live account, or a Google account, or a Facebook account, which hopefully covers most of the planet. And in this case, I'll just use my live account, which is what I'm already logged in, but I want to emphasize that it is not creating a site in my subscription. I don't need to have a subscription here. I could have been in any old live ID that has never heard of Azure, and this would have worked. And now I have this little site, which is good for an hour. It's really just to play with it, to get a taste. So it's a great way for people that haven't used Azure at all before to discover it without making any commitment, without having to get, because even though you can get a free subscription trial, there's still a lot of forms to fill up and credit card and stuff like that. With this thing, it's like super, super simple. And here I'll wrap up. So the key takeaways is when it comes to provisioning and deployment, you really need to automate or die. Like you can't have a working workflow where you're just piecemeal building your resources in the portal. Portal is great to discover the resources, but really you need automation, and ARM templates is the way to do it, along with continuous deployment. So my hope is that after this talk, you'll go back and try to learn a little bit more about ARM templates. They've been around for a little while, maybe a little over a year, but the usage has been, to this point, pretty low. But now they've added support for VMs and for all kind of Azure resources. So really, you have to expect this will soon become the way that everything is deployed to Azure. So you know the drill for this, and I'll leave it for Q&A. So that was the talk. Thank you.
Hi, just one question. So the impression I'm getting is the way to generate those template files is by hand.
That's a great question. Yes. So you are correct that today you do not get a whole lot of help in terms of authoring those templates. There are all kinds of tools down the pipe that will cater to those scenarios. So, but yes, today it's your best bet is to find some existing templates and modify them. Well, there is something you can install called Azure Cloud Deployment Project, which is kind of the first step in that direction, but it needs to go a lot farther.
Hi, I use Entity Framework Code First Migrations, and I was curious how to handle the testing slots if it was going to do a migration.
I was actually using Entity Framework in the sample as well here. So
sometimes the database gets different models, and then the DB context barfs, right? Because it doesn't see the same model.
Say that again, sorry. If the model changes, you mean?
Yeah, so if the model changes between versions, then it's going to want to try to update it. But if people are still on the old production version.
Yes. So I think, yeah, if you're going to share database between the staging slot and the production slot, you need to make sure that your changes are backward compatible. In which case, if your migration, say, just adds a column, the other slot will be fine.
I was under the impression that it barfs either way because it looks at the binary version of the model, as opposed to looking for breaking changes.
Okay, I have to admit to not being an EF expert, but that's a great question, though.
Okay.
Thank you.